Thank you for being with us here again at the weekly Bible study at First Baptist Church of Lancaster. You know, one of the most common phrases that we as Americans throw around when it comes to measuring happiness or satisfaction or even ambition is the phrase, or sometimes in the form of a question, are you a half glass full type of person or a half glass empty type of person? The idea being that all things being equal, some people are very positive in their perspective and some people are rather negative in their perspective. And I think there's some value to this proverbial statement or question. You know, I consider my wife, Cindy, to be more or less a glass half full type of person. She's one of those type of people that early in the morning, especially on a work day when we're all up and I'm kind of leaned over the sink, about to shave, and I've got a look on my face like I'm about to bite somebody. And she walks in and says, "Good morning." And I just have this sense immediately to say, "Stop doing that. What's the matter with you?" But really, I'm pretty glad that she's actually like that. Now, me, on the other hand, I'm not generally a glass half full type of person. In fact, I don't even know if you could characterize me as a glass half empty type of person. I mean, in many cases, I'm more or less somebody's knocked over my glass type of person. But you see, it's really a matter of perspective. You know, all the situations or conditions are the same, but the perspective is drastically different. Now, Chuck Swindoll addressed this topic and picked up on the words of Thomas Jefferson that he wrote in the Declaration of Independence when he said that we all have the inalienable right for the pursuit of happiness. And what Swindoll said, he said, as I've grown up as an adult, I've begun to recognize that the truth of the pursuit of happiness is in reality a hollow pursuit. And he asked this question: how many times have you found real joy or real satisfaction outside of yourself? When was the last time you found something out there that brought real satisfaction or joy, as Jefferson was talking about in his words? Now, the idea is that if I add something to my life, I've got this guarantee of joy, or at least the anticipation of joy. Or somehow joy or happiness is over there or out there. If I can just have that, or if I can just be there or get to this point or have that person, all my experiences will be full of joy. Now, we've all lived in this sort of capacity in some way or another in all the stages of life. Swindoll again says this: joy is a choice. It's a decision that one makes to be happy. If there's any pursuit to it, it's an internal pursuit, an internal journey that leads one to joy regardless of the external circumstances. And I have to ask myself, do I require things or people or circumstances in order to anticipate happiness or joy? Is happiness out there? When I come to the next stage of life, it's future, or was it in the past, in the good old days? Is that when happiness begins there, or was it back there? The key to having and maintaining joy, according to Paul, is having the mind of Christ. To have a proper perspective as informed by the Word of God, yielded to the Spirit of God, and to not be overcome by difficulties or circumstances. Now, I said several weeks back that Paul is a living, breathing model for Christian joy in whatever circumstances he found himself. Now, I want you to try and imagine this man who was called to be the evangelist to the Gentiles, with the calling and the passion to share the gospel, crisscrossing first across Syria, and then Cilicia, and then Crete, and then all across Asia Minor and throughout all of Greece, everywhere, beginning new churches and discipling new converts, always looking to go to the next city or the next region for the gospel of Christ, and with the ultimate vision to go on to Rome and then even on to Spain. And here, for the last 4 to 5 years of his life, he spent in a prison, first in Caesarea, falsely imprisoned in Caesarea, then chained to a Roman centurion or Roman guard on a ship bound for Rome, shipwrecked, and now in house arrest, again chained to a Roman guard, or more likely 4 Roman guards on 6-hour shifts. How devastating that would be. And one would think he would almost be in mourning at the loss of freedom, the loss of his vision, the loss of friends, the loss of dignity, the loss of his reputation, and most of all, the collapse of his ministry, right? But here's what he says, and I want to pick it up where we left off in Philippians last week. This is Philippians 1, 12 through 14. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of my brothers, having become confident by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Now, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in that I rejoice. And yes, I will rejoice. Now, Paul recognizes that by now the Philippians had heard about his predicament, that he was in chains, imprisoned, and in a rented residence, that his traveling ministry days had been suspended, that he was anticipating having to be on trial before Nero with the possibility of execution. And I'm sure they were horrified at the thought that this spiritual mentor of theirs, this beloved friend of theirs, was in the circumstances that he found himself in. But this is what he says, but I want you to know, I want you to understand. I don't want you to be having some presumption or conclusion based on my conditions that everything's bad, but rather this has been a bonus for me because the gospel has been advanced. It hasn't been halted. I'm sure Paul would have preferred not to be in the condition that he was in, that this wasn't the situation that he had anticipated or had hoped for. But what he was saying to them was that God had a better idea. He had a better plan for me than I have. And in fact, you would assume that my imprisonment would have put an end to my ministry of the gospel, but rather it has served to advance the gospel. And therefore, I found rejoicement and rejoicing in these chains. Ravi Zacharias, in a message about convictions that conquered the world, pointed out that one of the characteristics of members of the early church, especially the church leaders, was that they recognized the finger of God moving purposely throughout history with God as its center. If you look back at the early sermons by Peter at Pentecost, by Stephen with the defense of the gospel before the Sanhedrin, right before they stoned him to death, with Paul in Antioch, as we find in Acts 13, all of them went back in time in history, in the history of Israel, and recounted how God had constantly moved throughout history in the preparation and ultimately in the fulfillment of His eternal plan of redemption and salvation that was actualized in the death, burial, and resurrection of His Son, Jesus. Even Jesus on the road to Emmaus, as we find in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 24, 13 through 35. Now you remember the story. There were two disciples or students of Jesus that were on the road to Emmaus from Jerusalem. Cleopas and another traveled on the same day that the tomb was discovered to be empty. And they talked about the events that occurred over the last 3 days. And Luke says that while they talked and reasoned, that Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were restrained and they did not know him. And Jesus asked about what it was that they were in such deep discussion. And in one of the great ironies in the Word of God, Cleopas looks up at Jesus astonished. And I'm sure that there was a certain cynicism and disbelief in his voice. And he says, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? And have you not known the things that have happened there in these days?" And Jesus says, "What things?" And they went on to tell him of Jesus of Nazareth, the great prophet, who had been given up by the chief priests for crucifixion, that they had hoped that he was the true Messiah that had come to redeem Israel, but he had been crucified and buried. How some of the women on that very day and certain of the disciples had gone to the tomb and found it empty, and they wondered at all of this. And Jesus said to them, "Oh, foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all the prophets have spoken, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and enter into glory?" And Luke says that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, that Jesus expounded in all of the Scriptures the things concerning himself. Now here were two followers of Jesus, two students of the great rabbi, with the hope of the redemption of Israel by the Christ, and they could not understand the chaos of the events of the last 3 days, where all of their hopes and dreams that they had seemed to have come crashing down around them. And despite the report that their hope was no longer in the grave, they still didn't understand what was happening, and they were trying to make sense of it all. And yet that very hope, their Christ was walking with them all of that time. And here was the principal character in God's redemptive plan, Jesus, the very Son of God, who had suffered an agonizing death on the cross, who had been buried and had been raised by the power of God on the third day, all of which the prophets are foretold. And they ask him, "Do you not know what has happened?" He did. He knew. And folks, he still knows. Friends, when there is chaos all around and the events in this world make no sense, there is suffering and pain and poverty and want and loss and unrest and injustice and hatred and division and hopelessness, and you begin to question why. God, are you not seeing all that is happening? He does. He knows. And when the life that you had envisioned and the plans that you had made for yourself come to a screeching halt because of some catastrophic event, unforeseen, and you wonder about God's providence, He knows. Or maybe your ministry field is parched and seems to have dried up and there is no harvest, and your spiritual life has grown stale, and you wonder if God is still working in your world today. He is. He knows. You see, what Paul, like so many of those early church leaders, they were convinced that despite what seemed to be a complete and total reversal of everything that he had planned and hoped for, he trusted in the sovereignty of God and was convinced that God was moving throughout history with Christ at the center. And when Paul came to the place that despite the fact that he had lost it all, that nothing else mattered but the progress of the gospel, and that he made himself available to God to use according to his plan rather than Paul's own, Paul began to realize and to rejoice that God would use even his imprisonment as an opportunity for the progress of the gospel. Henry Blackaby, in his Experiencing God series, encouraged us to look about and find out where God is working and join him there. It's about perspective, to look for opportunities rather than obstacles. Christians, this is no time for retreat, to hunker down and wait for the rapture. When I'm feeling helpless and disheartened by the conditions that I find all around me, and I have those gnawing feelings of doubt and despair, is Jesus saying to me, is he saying to you, O foolish generation, slow of heart, in this fallen world in need of redemption, ought not these things to have happened? This is why I came. This is why I called you. Jesus said to his disciples in the upper room discourse on the night of his betrayal in John 14, he said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I do, and greater works will he do, because I am going to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, this I will do, that the Father will be glorified in the Son." Now, Paul goes on to say that the gospel had been advanced and had become known in all of the praetorium, and by the way, all of the rest, as a result of my imprisonment for Christ. Now, the word praetorium came to mean either a place or a body of people. Initially, it was the place where the general stayed in camp, where he performed strategy and issued orders. And it eventually became to mean the residence of the general, or the residence or the palace of the emperor. And that's kind of how the translators of the King James Version translated it, as the palace. But they didn't have access to some of the ancient manuscripts that have been discovered since the 17th century. And in those documents, the word is used always to mean a group of people, specifically a group known as the Praetorian Guard. Now, this was a group of elite, hand-picked Roman soldiers who served as the Roman Imperial Guard. They were more or less the bodyguard or the guard for the emperor, and as such, they were in charge of the imperial prisoners. Now, this group was initiated or started by Augustus, and there was 10,000 hand-picked soldiers, but the Emperor Vitellius had grown it to 16,000 by his time. They became a very powerful and influential group, and were eventually known as kingmakers because of the tremendous power and influence they had over the selection of the emperor. Now, what Paul tells the Philippians, that has become known throughout all of this Praetorian Guard. And by the way, the rest as a result of my imprisonment, of my change for Christ. My disadvantage, my suffering, rather than hindering, has progressed the spread of the gospel of Christ even to the highest and the most influential arenas of Rome. And it is because of my chains. Now, the word that's translated progressed or advanced here is a word that gives a sense of progress despite resistance or obstacles. It was a reference to pathfinders who went ahead of a traveling army and cut down trees and underbrush in order to make a way for the advancement of the army. Now, don't you think that members of the struggling churches, the little bodies of believers in Rome, had been praying for years that somehow they could make inroads to the highest levels of power and influence with the gospel in a hope that almost seemed just totally out of reach. And what Paul is saying, I want you to know that because of my chains for Christ, we've reached all of the Praetorian Guard and all the rest. Ravi Zacharias related an experience he had some time back when he was traveling with a friend and fellow believer of the name of Sammy Dagar. Sammy was a devout Christian native to the country of Lebanon, and he and Ravi were driving through Beirut on their way in Sammy's van on their way to Sidon. And on the way, a group of Syrian soldiers stopped them at a checkpoint in the city. And one of the soldiers ordered Sammy to lower his window. And as he pointed his automatic weapon at the both of them, Ravi added that it was as close as he ever wanted to be to the barrel of a gun. And there was a real immediate sense of danger and anxiety and tension there. And the soldier looks at Sammy and asks, "Do you have any explosives?" And Sammy looked up at him and said, "Yes. As a matter of fact, the whole van is loaded with explosives." And he reaches his arm up to the top of the van, covered by a tarp, and pulls down a red-colored copy of the Gospel of John and says, "Here is the dynamite, but it's not the kind that can hurt you, and I have thousands of them up there." Well, the guard was kind of taken back, and I don't think he knew exactly what to do. And he looked at them kind of strangely, and ultimately he waved them on, and they continued on to Sidon, or towards Sidon. But at some point on the way, Sammy pulled up on the side of the road and put his head down on the steering wheel. And Ravi said that he would never forget the pathos in his voice. And Sammy said, "My brother Ravi, when I saw 50,000 Syrian soldiers marching into my country, I was angry with my God. I got on my knees one night and I said, 'God, what are you doing with my land? It's being torn apart by religious fanaticism. And God, already there is a foreign religion trying to take over, and I've been asking you to let the gospel take hold here. I've been asking and pleading with you, and what do? You allow 50,000 Syrian soldiers to come in here.' And he said, I was getting stronger in my voice, and I felt God interrupt me and say, 'Wait a minute, Sammy. You are the one who's been complaining to me for years that Syria does not allow missionaries. Since Syria does not allow missionaries, I've sent 50,000 of them to you, and you are still complaining.'" Folks, it's perspective. It's God working in history. It's not obstacles, it's opportunities. For centuries, the Church of Jesus Christ in America has and continues to send missionaries all over the world to share the gospel, to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, to bring comfort to those who mourn, to bring the oil of beauty for ashes and the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint heart. That work does and should continue, but God has brought the world to us. That calling of Jesus is upon us, here and now. The disciples on the road to Emmaus, when their eyes were opened and realized it was Jesus, said, "Didn't our hearts burn within us when He walked with us and opened to us the Scriptures?" And Luke says that they rose up that very hour and returned the 7 miles to Jerusalem to share their good news. Should not our hearts have that same burning within us to rise up and share the good news. Thank you for being with us this week. Have a wonderful week. God bless you.